Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Simundza. I'm a research scientist at the Global Forum on Urban and Regional Resilience. It means that I work with David Bieri in the Financial Resilience Lab. I'd like to take a moment just to echo David's comments and just, again, welcome everyone, say how happy we are to be here with you all. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be a moderator on this panel with such distinguished and diverse panelists. And kind of as you see, we have 6 panelists, about an hour, so I think what we'll try to do is get right to it. The topic of this panel is decentralization, generating trust without authority. Okay? And what we're going to focus on is one of the defining features of the blockchain, its ability to generate decentralized consensus. Okay? So decentralized meaning that data is stored across the peer-to-peer network and not at a central authority. And consensus meaning that all users agree and believe in the current state of the system. Okay, so that will be our focus. What I'd like to do is offer the panelists 3 to 5 minutes in order to introduce themselves, give a bit of history about their background, their experience, their professional experience, and any experience that they have with the blockchain. Okay? And then after everybody's had a chance to introduce themselves, we'll have an opportunity for some more free-flowing discussion. Okay, so if we can, I'll start immediately to my left with Bill McBeath.
Thanks. We're going to do the slides now too. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Bill McBeath. I'm Chief Research Officer and co-founder of Chainlink Research. We're a boutique industry analyst firm founded in 2002. We focus on supply chain, Internet of Things, and blockchain. And our focus on supply chain started out largely looking at the inter-enterprise space of supply chain rather than as an internal function, so what goes on between companies. So we've done a lot of work in supply chain networks, which turns out to be very relevant, I think, to blockchain. The slide that's up here now shows some of the existing or the emerging applications of blockchain in supply chain that we're seeing. One of the areas, the first area is around sort of provenance and traceability and a chain of custody, so the ability to really prove that something came from where it came and sort of what hands it's been in. The other place we're seeing is this global trade enablement. IBM and Maersk are doing a lot. If you look at what it takes to get product from point A to point B, especially if you're going across oceans and crossing borders, there's a tremendous amount of paperwork that goes on. A lot of that is because of lack of trust, and also a lot of it is literally paper these days, or else emails and stuff going back and forth, and it puts a lot of delay. So we're seeing a lot of interest in how we can use blockchain to streamline those processes. And the third area is supply chain finance. So today we're seeing a lot of interest in how people can enable finance across supply chains, lower rates, and also lower the amount of risks to the various parties. Maybe get more exposure to the actual performance of the players, because that's where a lot of the risk comes in. Is this supplier really going to deliver, and is this buyer really going to pay? Spot markets is another area we see things, and I'm going to skip over those because we only have limited time the rest of this. So if you can go to the next slide. So the other thing I want to point out is that blockchain competes with every other tool that we have at our disposal to solve problems. So in other words, we're in a period of a honeymoon period with blockchain right now, but as time goes on, people try to make rational decisions and so forth. So the area that we look at, we've looked a lot at the architecture of systems that enterprises use, and people talk about the evolution to cloud-based systems or software as a service. We point out this distinction, which I know there's a lot of stuff on this graph, but between enterprise SaaS and network SaaS. So enterprise SaaS is where you're sharing code across everybody, but the data is enterprise by enterprise in silos. So if you have a supplier that's onboarded by enterprise A, then enterprise B has the same supplier, they have to onboard them, and that information about that supplier is kept separate. Network SaaS has data that's shared across the network, And that's really good for supply chain. So the example of the supplier is now the supplier come on board once onto the network, not onto an individual enterprise, and everyone across the network sees that supplier, and the data is changed once. You can also have transactions that are shared across the network. So like a purchase order that gets put in, now you have this single version of the truth sitting in the network between the buyer and the seller, that they all agree this is the purchase order, or this is the advanced ship notice of what we sent. That technology, so if you can build to the next slide, that technology, network SaaS, does almost everything that blockchain does. The one area that blockchain covers that it doesn't is immutability, and you could achieve that by adding blockchain sort of almost to the side of the network SaaS technology. So that's one of the questions that we're looking at is you know, where does blockchain fit in all of this? And our contention is that blockchain will be inevitably, for anything interesting, integrated with other technologies and existing technologies. So this question of what belongs on-chain versus off-chain, because on-chain resources today, at least, are very expensive. And we'll also get into the kinds of consensus algorithms that you can have. So blockchain purists will say, hey, it has to be proof of work, although people are talking about proof of stake these days. But if you look at, if you step back and say, hey, what's right for this situation, you could have a consensus algorithm that's only between the parties involved. Maybe they're the ones who have to reach consensus. And as long as their identities haven't been compromised, that gives you the scalability that you need for these large networks. So I think that's enough of my opening comments, and I'll let the next person.
That's great. Thank you, Bill. And so immediately to Bill's left is Bernadette Kogler of RiskSpan.
Yep, I'm co-founder and CEO of RiskSpan. We're a data and analytics company that provides software to investors in structured products and mortgage and consumer loans. So we started researching blockchain technology roughly 3 years ago, specifically to really research, could it play a role, how could it play a role in possibly helping to restore, which does not exist anymore, what we refer to as the private label mortgage securities market. So in mortgage finance, the way the markets worked is there are government-backed securities today, and that is largely the only thing really that exists today in terms of mortgage-backed securities. Pre-crisis, the way the system did work was that there were a series of parties that are involved in any particular transaction that are really what I think of as agents of trust. So those could represent, for example, a due diligence firm that is hired and engaged to verify consumer loan data, a person, you know, the value of a house, and various elements that are part of underlying collateral of a mortgage-backed bond, all the way up through a rating agency. And in the crisis, we really saw a complete failure of every single individual point of trust through that system. So we're experimenting, I should just say, what is called permission-based blockchain, right? They are specifically for business purposes. We're working closely with IBM and certain institutions that are really, at this point, it's still very much in the experimental stage. But the idea would be, the way I think about enterprise use for blockchain is that if you have a series of intermediaries that all really need and want the same information, that is one purpose. And when there are agents of trust, so institutions that exist whose sole purpose is to verify a piece of data, verify a payment calculation, then that is, I think, an ideal opportunity for blockchain technology. The other, I think, important point that Bill was mentioning is it's not just blockchain, and the way we think about it is really automation and verification of the information that will be published to a blockchain that is really critical. So this idea of consensus and verification of, in the case of a mortgage-backed bond, all of the underlying information about the consumer credit, the underwriting programs of a financial institution, the rating, how does a bond perform under various scenarios, economic scenarios and other, that is really instrumental, and that the parties agree up front in the form of a consensus before the transaction is really distributed. So that's what we're focused on. We do think where we are, I was just in New York earlier this week talking to probably 5 or 6 different institutions, and I would say companies are all over the place. So some have experimented, some are just in the education of blockchain and what it is, understanding how it can be used for their businesses. But I can see once people do understand the implications for enterprise use, I do think acceleration is going to happen rather quickly, and that we will see adoption and this idea of transparency, particularly in the mortgage markets, that it can be a tremendous piece of technology and really transformative.
Great. Thank you, Bernadette. And so next up is Blacksburg's own Manu Sporny.
Hi, my name's Manu. I'm a computer scientist. Went to tech almost 18 years ago now and have been in the area. 5-time entrepreneur. All of those companies have been started out of Blacksburg. 1 failure, 1 good exit, and 3 in process. I wanted to ask a question to the audience. How many of you have searched for a business or a restaurant on Google? So you go to the search bar, you type in a restaurant or a business just to find out their phone number or their hours of operation. So show of hands. Just about all of us, right? So there's a time where you couldn't do that in Google. What we had identified about 10 years ago was that Google, through their AI initiatives, were having a really hard time figuring out just simple information. What number should you use to call a business? What are the opening hours? And so what many people don't realize, and one of the things that I think is great about this area is that technology was actually invented in Blacksburg. In fact, it was invented 2 blocks away from here. My companies, what they tend to do is they identify really hard problems in the marketplace, and they go and try to create international standards to solve those problems. So rather than say, we're going to go it alone, we're going to create this one thing, we try to figure out how to make it scale. So that it shows up in search engines like Google and Microsoft. So that technology was created at something called the World Wide Web Consortium. We work with organizations like the Internet Engineering Task Force. Our companies work with payments, identity, and blockchain. So where those things intersect is where we do a lot of our work. That technology I'm talking about is used on over 250 million websites now. So there's a technology that was homegrown in Blacksburg that is now globally used. It's got full support in the standards organizations. And so that project was really about business identity, right? It was how do we enable these businesses to claim their identity on the internet, and rather than Google guessing what their store hours were, how do we invent a technology that lets them express, this is me, this is my business, these are my opening hours, these are my customers, this is how they rate me, how do you do that? So the idea that I'd like to kind of explore today at this symposium is how do we bring that power to the individual? So I don't know if we can jump to the slide. So what we have here on the left-hand side is identity as it exists today on the internet, right? Your identity is fractured, it's siloed, you're renting it, you're leasing your identity, right? So if you have a Facebook account, if you have a Twitter account, that account can be taken away from you, it can be shut down, and you really have hardly any repercussion. What we'd like to figure out how to transition, or what we'd like to transition to, is something that we're called self-sovereign identity. And it turns out that blockchain technologies are fundamental for this transformation. Before blockchain technologies existed, it was impossible to do this kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take your credentials, your identity, out of these silos where they exist today and move them to you, right? To make it so that you are the owner of your identity. You are in control of it. Your data can't be taken away from you. You choose when to share information. So if we can jump to the next slide. We work by bringing together a large number of organizations. This technology is called decentralized identifiers or verifiable credentials. We work with Microsoft, IBM, Department of Homeland Security, Customs Border Protection, Educational Testing Service, many, many organizations, 400 plus organizations, to try to build this technology into the core architecture of the web. In addition, we're not just one blockchain technology solution provider trying to do this. We, in order for these things to hit scale, in order for 250 million websites to use this technology, you have to convince everyone to play with one another, right? That's where these international standards come together. And so we have collected, for the first time ever, developers from the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, the Sovereign blockchain, the Verus1 blockchain. We've gotten them all in the same room, not throwing chairs at each other, but trying to agree on how we bring this concept of decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity to everyone. So thank you very much. On to our next one.
Great, thank you, Manu. So that sort of wraps up the first half of our panelists, which is kind of more the entrepreneurial side. The second half is more of academic expert side. So we start with Dr. Chris Barrett, who's the director of the Biocomplexity Institute at Virginia Tech.
First of all, thank you for asking me to be here. So this is an interesting segue, actually. I had prepared some slides. I don't have 2 slides because I made extremely technical slides because I misunderstood the setting, and he sent me just right yesterday. I didn't have time to fix them. So I'm going to tell you what they said, only I'm going to say it in ways that I think are much more appropriate for here. So the Biocomplexity Institute that I lead is 250 people in a giant bag of cats and dogs. I mean, we're all different kinds of scientists. I'm a theoretician and a computer scientist, but there's lots of different kinds of scientists in the Biocomplexity Institute. And what we're tied together through is a platform that's essentially a computational science platform that is focused. The words we use are slightly different, but essentially on decentralized systems. I'll just take this down one path here in a minute, but I just want to raise a couple of issues. In all the worlds that they've talked about, but they haven't raised this issue, is not all behavior by definition is cooperative. There's lots of non-cooperative behavior in the world. Whatever the systems are that we build, we're not going to eliminate non-cooperative behavior. And non-cooperative behavior can be over competition for resources in the biological world, or economic resources in the economic world, and there's some sort of, at the abstract level, some sort of similarity as well as differences in these kinds of competitions. But they lead to the generality is that the data in the world that we have to use, even in this big data world we talk about in social media or elsewhere, is not, the generality is it's wrong. The generality is not that it's true. The generality is that it's wrong. It's either temporally wrong, or it's missing, or it's intentionally deceptive, or many other things. And if you indiscriminately go in and do your big data world thing, you have to realize that you're making an assumption. If you're, most of us as scientists sort of assume, right, that this is data, so this is the holy grail, this is where the truth is in the data. But the fact is that the generality is it's wrong. And so as a result, we have to worry about how it is that we bring this information together to study things like, and this is where the biocomplexity thing comes in, the legitimacy of a question. Not as a whole lot of little questions, although there's lots of little questions in it, but as a question, things like, how does public policy associated with the use of antibacterial substances affect us? And that question goes from policy issues to commercial and pharmaceutical company issues to social norms of hygiene and cleanliness and how we're advertised and what it's legal to sell and how we use it, all the way down to entropy-based mutation forces on genetic material, and then competition-based fitness functions happening at that level, so that we wind up with things like bacteria that are resistant to antibacterial substances, and they're pathogens for us, but they're not. They're just stuff that's in a competitive relationship with us. That's a legitimate question in its total form. And what this gives rise to is the notion of a decentralized, although we don't call it decentralized, we call it unencapsulated entity. Okay, and that, so we like to think of, if we have a, let's say it's a simulation, and we have we specialize in gigantic simulations of things like little pieces of dissimilar stuff, so people will simulate every single person in the United States, every single activity in the United States, every single interaction of a certain kind in the United States for some period of time. We wind up with these gigantic data structures, but what does it all reference to? Why do we do that? The reason we do it is not to do the simulation. We do it because certain facts in the world are not numbers, they're procedures. And that's really lucky, because if we had to store all the numbers, there'd be really a lot of numbers. And if you store procedures, you can generate the numbers later if you can just point to the right procedure. But you still have to know how to stick them together. And that mathematical process is a simulation, not a regression. Okay? So we generate these big things where all the data in the world is organized around the people in the United States, which means we use it in different ways than if it was all organized around something else. So these people, what are these people? Well, we can call them agentic, we can call them individuals, but the fact is they're decentralized. So if I ask you, it shouldn't be a big stretch in this group, if I say something like, okay, so you're an agent, so I guess you live inside your shirt, right? I mean, if anything inside your shirt, that's you. Outside your shirt, not you, right? That's not true. I mean, it's obviously not true. I can say, as a matter of your agency, where's your money? Where's your debt? Where's the process that services your debt with your money? You say, well, that's true, it's not in my shirt, but it's really not part of me either. And I say, well, it actually is. It didn't necessarily used to be exactly like that, but it sure is now, and it ties to what we just heard, is because that is actually you. It's as much you as this is you, and what this gives rise to is the following point, and I'll get to blockchain in a minute, because blockchain has something to do with this, and not just blockchain, but technologies like blockchain. We are not just interacting because I'm talking to you. We're interacting bacterially. We're interacting virally. We're interacting, we put a common load on the air conditioning system. We're interacting in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of them that are not even aware of, with each other and with all kinds of things all the time. And they all have this kind of property that they're not really inside your shirt, right? And so we're decentralized. What you are is sort of an address, if you want to use what's happening. So as we pull these things together, and the data in the world is all changing, and some of it's wrong and might need to be corrected, or we might discover it couldn't possibly be true, or it isn't our job to fix all the wrong data in the world. It's to build things to understand what to do. We just want to know what to do. It's not my responsibility to fix everything that's wrong. I just want to know what to do, right? So I have to generate this stuff. So if I pull this stuff together, what I at least want to have is a provenance record of all the information that was contingent up to the point that I made some state estimator for that object, right? And it may not be right, but I don't want you to be able to mess with it. And I might not want you to be able to mess with it for scientific reproducibility reasons, or I might not want to be able to mess with it for other reasons, right? And so I guess that this is all I'll say about that, other than to say that this kind of collective thinking is, first of all, completely decentralized thinking. As far as I know, like, my entire career has been focused on, which is unfortunately longer than, anyway, but so I've lost a lot of fights on a decentralized argument, and I'll just give you one example, and then I'm just going to cut to the end. In the sort of late and middle 1980s, I was part of this project called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I worked on a distributed satellite viewing system that was a bunch of ad hoc, pretty uncontrolled satellites that had to automatically generate view-down apertures, synthetic apertures across opportunistic satellites that happened to be over a part of the Earth. And they had to figure it out themselves because nobody was able to sort out where these things were exactly. In the course of that, we figured out how to move information in a decentralized way and secure it and move it point to point and not just do the look down, but do a bunch of other stuff, right? And I'll just say that that was an alternative to the current satellite radio system. They built that one because they understood it, because it was centralized. And the upshot of it is they can only support 28,000 simultaneous satellite phone calls on Earth with that system. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And I lost, okay? But it's getting to be easier to talk about decentralized systems, so that's a good thing. So anyway, so I'll leave it at that. This notion of how to deal with provenance, and the provenance of these things is its value. So the information storage and transmission characteristics of these things is extremely important, but we do have to take very seriously non-cooperative behavior, lying. Those are things you're not going to snuff out with a blockchain because you might be encrypting a lie. And it's not your job to figure out if it's a lie when you encrypt it, and it's just your job to preserve it so that you can at least explain why you did something, right? I think it's a really important, we're not going to solve truth, okay? And we're not going to all be trusting. Those words need to be corrected. They need to be focused into the realities.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Next panelist is Dr. Nic Tideman from Virginia Tech Department of Economics.
I work on problems of public policy, group decision-making, and I have an interest in monetary reform, and all of these things have something to do with blockchain, but I haven't examined blockchain in any detail, so I'm just sort of here as a general purpose economist, I think.
Thank you, Nick.
You always need one of those.
And next up is Charles Clancy.
So certainly you've seen my slides so far. I guess I'll just offer an anecdote of my introduction to blockchain, which I think was fairly interesting. About 5 years ago, I ran into one of my graduate students in the hallway, and my graduate student was holding a brown lunch bag, and I was like, what do you have in there? And inside was $5,000. Why do you have $5,000 in a lunch bag? And he's like, well, I'm going to meet a guy on a street corner in Georgetown because I intend to purchase some Bitcoin. What? What is Bitcoin? And I'll point out that in the last 5 years, I think Bitcoin obviously has matured significantly. You don't have to acquire Bitcoin on street corners in Georgetown anymore. I also learned that perhaps I'm paying my graduate students too much. Anyway, with that, I'll see you through.
Great. Thank you all. So next I have what I hope are a series of kind of provocative questions that I'll direct kind of in your general direction, but I'd encourage everyone, if you have a comment, please feel free to chime in. We'd kind of like to have a nice discussion, more organic discussion at this point.
Can I comment on one thing
Of
that
course.
Chris said, just because so this idea of the blockchain can encode lies, right, and incorrect data. One of our clients is a company called Zest Labs, and what they do is they track produce end to end, the temperature of it, and they've also developed these sophisticated models of how fast the produce decays based on this temperature exposure. So that now when it gets to the retailer, the way retailers do is they look at it, and they say, does this look any good or not? And that turns out to be a really bad way of telling how long this stuff's going to last. So if you have a temperature history, it's like far superior. But what happens is that people game the system. Like the workers, they're supposed to pick a pallet of lettuce, press the button, and it starts recording. they either might forget or they might just, on purpose, not press the buttons until everything's loaded up in the truck. Now you don't know it's sat in the sun for 4 hours, right? Or they're supposed to pre-cool it, they might stick that thing into like cold water because they don't have time to pre-cool it, right? Let's just get it on the truck so it'll look like it was pre-cooled. So what they've developed is algorithms to check for this type of gaming, because they've been doing this for 15 years and they know the kinds of games people play. So they say, we know lettuce takes 15 minutes to build a pallet. If we don't see that about every 15 minutes, something is wrong, right? Or if the temperature goes down too fast, something is wrong. So my only point is that I think that there's a role for gatekeepers of data coming onto the blockchain. And if you have a blockchain that has that kind of data quality input, then now that blockchain becomes more trustable. And in this case, you want to know that that's the right temperature because there's commercial decisions being made on that. So anyway, that was just my
Great,
point.
great. Thank you. So the first issue that I wanted to discuss is the relationship between trust and authority. Through its ability to generate decentralized consensus, the blockchain technology allows for one to have trust in a system without a centralized authority. The classic example here is electronic payments. So whereas previously a trusted intermediary, for instance a bank or PayPal, was needed to facilitate the transfer of money from one person to another electronically, the Bitcoin blockchain allows users to transfer funds directly without a central authority. So if I can, I'll start with Charles at the end. According to the kind of original Bitcoin paper, Nakamoto 2008, the blockchain provides a system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust. In general, or in cybersecurity in particular, is trust still necessary? If so, who or what do we need to trust? The miners, the code, the kind of keepers of the code?
It's a great question, right? I think it gets to the sort of underlying intrinsic nature of trust and identity that perhaps Chris was mentioning. I think in the concrete example of cryptocurrency, I think the interesting area of trust is really around the software developers who are maintaining the platform, right? That's a new area. I think, as I mentioned during my talk, you have the ability to affect monetary policy through software updates, and that is, we are, I think, ignoring the distributed consensus around management of the underlying software that implements these systems as an area I think that will need additional study as we move forward. But I think certainly the notions of, so one perspective is that, okay, we've eliminated the need for a trusted third party. Another is that the blockchain itself is that trusted third party that is simply synthesized from many, many parties who are all managing it. So we still have a trusted third party that we're using to broker trust. It's just a decentralized trusted third party and therefore is less vulnerable to many of the attacks against current instantiations of trusted third parties.
Sure. And maybe I could next turn to Manu. Kind of to follow up on that, are we moving in some way to a decentralized, trustless society? If not, what's holding us back?
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting question, right? Because it uses this word trustless, and you'll see trustless pop up time and time again, when in reality what these systems are doing is they're increasing our trust that the right thing's going to happen, right? It's not that we don't trust one another, it's that we can trust the outcome. Whatever's going to happen next, there's a record of the events leading up to that so that we can now trust with far more accuracy that the right thing's going to happen as a result of it. So, I think, Charles brings up an excellent point. These systems have tremendous amounts of trust built into them, right? There's the mathematical trust that is provable trust, like we can look at the mathematics, say the mathematics work out, and we can trust that layer of it. There's another part that's really interesting. So we do fit-for-purpose blockchains. Our company, I'm actually a blockchain developer myself. I write blockchain code, consensus code. And there is a tremendous amount of power that software developers have, and that power is absolutely going to have to be checked in time. We just launched a blockchain for identity called VerisOne. It's for decentralized identity. And one of the hardest problems that we've had to work on there is not the technical characteristics. The math has existed since the 70s. there's a tremendous amount of research on how to build these systems correctly. The thing that we're struggling with is the governance around the blockchain. How do we check these software developers so that they can't roll out an update that all of a sudden wipes refugees off of the map, right? Or allows a nation state to decide that people should not exist, people with this kind of background, with these types of attributes in the background in the blockchain should not exist. So a lot of the work that we've put in, the technology was built, we know that the technology works fairly well. Now how do we keep that technology from being corrupted? And that requires you to set up boards of governance, boards of directors to ensure the right checks and balances against the software developers and the board, ensure that the right financial and economic incentives are in place. So there's a tremendous amount. I think the most interesting work that's being done in the blockchain space now is not necessarily the technology, because it's old technology, but questions around economics and governance and incentives. So I think that's the thing that actually enables us to trust these systems more. We have to look at it holistically and ensure that all of those, we can trust all of the levels of the system, not just the blockchain itself, but how it's actually run over time.
I see. Bernadette,
Yeah,
do you have?
I have a couple of thoughts. So the concept of trust lists in financial markets, to me, doesn't really make sense, right? They don't operate without trust, and I've had large institutional investors tell me they'll never invest in another mortgage asset again unless it's like backed by the US government. So, you know, why is that? We think that can change, but there's really fundamentally two things. So there's the blockchain technology, which will allow kind of a shared, distributed distribution of information. However, to Chris's point, one of the fundamental issues that I think is even harder to solve is the verification of the information being posted to a blockchain. So how do we prevent fraud from happening? And the blockchain doesn't solve for that. However, there are technologies that exist that the way we're approaching it is not just blockchain, but the entire value chain. How do we incorporate other technologies that may exist about identity or other information that are incorporated into the consensus algorithm, the smart contracts that do verify it? Fraud, I don't think will ever go away. It'll never be eliminated, but you can certainly improve it. You can improve the process, and you can gain trust on the other end from, in my business, the investor community, so that they can understand, they can see, but what they're trusting is the process. They're trusting the systems. And it is interesting because in today's business world, there's something that is called where a process or security, there are audits done over that, right? SOC type 1 or 2 or what they're called. And you know, we're asked often, like, do you see something like that evolving? And quite frankly, in a permission blockchain, probably that will probably have to happen at some point, where there will be, again, but then you're adding a trusted party to do some type of audit on the process. So that's introducing another intermediary. So it's not quite the purest, right, Bitcoin blockchain that we're talking about at the enterprise level, but it is some hybrid perhaps and some combination of both of those things.
I see.
Yeah, I'd sort of second the motion there in the sense that if you, I think, well, first of all, in supply chains, permissioned blockchains are absolutely the way to go. If I'm going to be transacting with somebody, depending on them, I need to know who they are. It can't be some anonymous, I don't know who it is kind of thing. And attached to that person, I also want to reduce risk. So I want to know, I mean, you know, the obvious ways, if I've done business with them before, I can trust them. But if I haven't, how do I know they're going to come through and not just run away with my money or not come through for me? So those things are really important. And, you know, how we solve those, I guess I want to make one other point about decentralization and the architecture of commerce, as I call it. If you look, the old business model in the first part of the 20th century was of vertically integrated companies. And the peak of that might have been the Forge River Rouge plant, where they had iron ore coming in one end and cars going out the other, right? And they own their own rubber plantations. Right? You fast forward now and look at, you know, any manufactured product. It's made by literally thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of companies that get involved in making this. So our economy is already decentralized, or just, I guess, distributed and decentralized highly. Without, you know, pre-blockchain, that trend has been happening. Blockchain may just help that run a little more better, but you still need mechanisms for, as you said, that are usually going to be outside the blockchain. So I think people in the business world are not blockchain purists. They're going to take the bits and pieces of this that make the most sense to solve whatever problem they're solving.
It really seems kind of part of what I think I'm hearing from you is the blockchain system seems to have some nice properties in theory, and when you add humans to it, it really kind of gums up the works.
Yeah, those messy humans.
Yeah. So, Nic, if I could ask, I guess the question that I wanted to ask was something along the lines of, does would it be good for society to need less trust? Would it?
Certainly.
But it doesn't quite seem like
Yeah.
we're moving to a less trust society. We're moving to one
well-
where trust is placed in different areas.
Yeah.
So, do you have
I
thoughts on
think
this?
that the blockchain system offers the possibility of making it cheaper to acquire trust. I think that it would be nice if we could trust without any effort at all, but it doesn't work that way, and the blockchain makes it possible to have confidence at lower cost than otherwise, and that's why it's spreading.
And Chris, are we, is this issue of kind of trust and where it's placed, is this asking the right question from your point of view?
Well, there's a contradiction in the question because you're talking about decentralized systems and you're saying where.
Okay.
So there are functional locations which are not necessarily very well specified. It's like in distributed algorithms and other things are not very well GIS specified, right? So you have to be careful about what we mean by how functions arise because you might not even recognize it may be there like the smile of the Cheshire cat, it's sort of floating in an interaction and not embodied in any particular thing at all. There's a lot of examples of that, but I just like to, there's a few things that have sort of, I thought about when, and then I forgot about it, and then I remembered again when you were talking about it. And it had to do with just basic, there are absolutely underlying assumptions of trust that are sort of like this Cheshire cat going on. Okay, beyond, it's pretty dangerous to say that, you know, a bunch of people that think like I did when I was 25 years old are in charge of building this framework. That's a frightening prospect, and it's a frightening prospect because of something that is the implicit social norms in what you think is okay to do. And these revolve around many, many things. They're not just, you know, don't steal stuff and, you know, don't lie or whatever. It isn't like that. It's, I mean, well, partially it's like that, but it's not exclusively like that. There are all kinds of, essentially, when by social I don't mean polite society. I mean interactive, right? Even transactional in some cases, but not always transactional. Interactive, and not just among humans. Okay. These outcomes are so there's common knowledge. It's impossible to talk to somebody that is completely so far removed from what you just take for granted that it's just impossible to have a reasonable interaction with them because you don't share common knowledge. That's happening here, and it isn't. It's not in, you know, like asterisk. Oh, by the way, this is the common knowledge because it's implicit, and it's all over the place. And there are norms that we might think were pretty weird about the Roman Empire or something that are pretty common now, and that are not common now, and similarly other things. These common knowledge networks are something we're actually actively studying at the Biocomplexity Institute. We don't talk about it in terms of blockchain, but they're essentially real. We also have another project that talks about, it's a very simple thing, is how do you sign on as a prog in a GitHub group, right? And how does the group decide to let you in or not? Viewed as a problem in social psychology. And it has a lot to do with some of these common knowledge style things. There's a lot of implicit, and that's built into the production of the blockchain. And these are real dynamics, and these are structural things that are going in. So I guess this notion of coercive agreement, blockchain is sort of as a memory system. This is a very non-anthropomorphic, humans are involved in it, but it's a sort of a non-anthropomorphic concept. If you just think, usually memory can degrade, right? I mean, like, I don't know, I just forget stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I don't forget everything. But in a blockchain, if you screw it up, you forget everything. The coercion is, if you mess with this, you lose everything. But so does everybody else, so maybe you don't mind losing everything. Maybe you're on a suicide mission, right? The point is, those kinds of assumptions are built in, they're not explicit, and they have to be understood. They really do need to be better understood before we get much farther along. Or at least they need to be addressed as questions in their own right, something other than a programming problem.
So we had a question from the audience, and I'll just kind of pose it to the group in general. Anyone can take it. From the discussion, it seems that a certain authority from experts seems necessary. There seems to be a role of experts, given this issue of trust and where to place it. And to what extent do you find that to be the case? To what extent is this democratic? How is this going to affect the governance?
So I could try starting. So one of the things that is fairly largely reviled in the blockchain space is this word of authority and experts, right? I mean, so I'm just going to talk about this from a technologist perspective. And it's certainly not my perspective. I think that there's a lot of stuff happening in the blockchain space that it's running rampant because it is a group of 25 to 27-year-olds that think that there's this amazing new technology to play with, and they're running ahead with it without really understanding history or economics or sociology or the ramifications of the technology that's being built. There's a tremendous amount of money in the space. But the general thinking is, the world that we have now is pretty screwed up, right, which is an overstatement. And what we need is radical change. And this thing changes trust, quote unquote, radically, right? So it's worth running that experiment and seeing where it goes. Yes, we're going to break a lot of eggs in the process, but we don't see these problems being addressed, or they're being addressed too slowly. Now, again, this is not my view on this. I'm much older than 25 years old. So trying to engage, we work on international standards. So the whole point here is to get a lot of people together to agree on what the right way forward is, and that is a very social process. It has almost nothing to do with technology. And the hardest thing that we've found is convincing these 25 and 27-year-olds that there are, for example, we were able to sit down with the creator of TLS, the Transport Layer Security, which secures effectively the entirety of it's your padlock icon in your browser. Person that created much of that technology, his name is Christopher Allen. We were able to get Sir Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the web, and some of these people that are creating these blockchains down together, sitting at the same table and say, okay, what does the future of this technology look like if we apply 20 or 30 years of the evolution of the internet and the web? And the good news there is that, that is an example of authority and experts coming to the table to try and teach the newer generation that there are a number of pitfalls that you're not paying attention to. There's social dynamics, there are inherent risks that you're programming into these systems that when they hit the size of the web and the internet have tremendous ramifications for humanity and society. The way that you write the code literally determines whether or not someone is able to say, I exist or I don't, in rural India. So I think there is absolutely a need for experts in the space, but at the same time there's a strong tension and disbelief by a lot of the people that are developing these blockchains that the experts have done a good job of steering society in the right way over the last 30 years.
I'd like to jump in. I think this relates to the topic of ICOs, and I want to contrast ICOs with the traditional venture model. Okay, so in traditional venture capital, you've got a bunch of funds, and so people give their money to experts, right? They're supposedly experts, saying, "Go find some companies to buy with my money," right? So, and we've helped a few VCs look at companies. So there is a due diligence process, and it's hard, and they make mistakes often, but hopefully they get it right more than they do. But and even if you have multiple investors, they may rely on one to, you're the lead investor. We know you're putting in 10 million, so we'll put in $1 million and trust you to do the due diligence. So that's kind of the traditional model, and they spend a lot of effort to make sure that 10 million is going to go to not go to waste. Now you look at an ICO, and somebody publishes a white paper and says, "World, give me some money," right, or buy my coins, and so you've got thousands of people, and they can't possibly do that level of due diligence, right? So there's no expert in the equation in that case, and we're already starting to see fraud in that area, and even if it's not intentional fraud, somebody might be very convincing in a paper, but there's really nothing there, right? So I think there's an example where expertise makes a huge difference in this idea that you can run everything by voting on everything. I just somebody has to roll up their sleeves and kind of focus their efforts to solve an additional problem. It can't just be, sort of wisdom of the crowd.
I have just one more comment.
Sure.
So this issue of trust, and what's really interesting in banking is it's a highly regulated industry. We're talking about consumer information. When you get a loan, you're giving your bank every information about your credit history and everything else. And so in the blockchain world, there's IBM, right? And IBM has invested, is making a big bet on blockchain and cloud. And, they're one of our partners. We have other partners, but, we partnered with IBM because of their brand, right? And reputation. And de facto, they're trusted in the banking space. And they probably have, almost every major financial institution as a client of theirs. So it is interesting, right? Because in banking, we think they're going to have a presence because of their brand, and they're a trusted force, and they're going to be behind the privacy and everything else and security of their blockchain platform. So, who knows where this will evolve, but we'll see. And I think that is a big part of why they probably will have a major presence, at least in the U.S. financial markets.
Yeah.
I want to make a short comment, is that there are lots of different kinds of voting schemes. And from a purely technical point of view, they're just fraught with paradoxes and problems, technical problems. And there are no bias-free voting schemes. There's no such thing. It would be a really good idea if you took that on board and just thought about it when you're. We all love democracy and everything, but voting schemes are something you have to be careful with, especially on this scale. One other comment, just a question really, is what do we do with all the stuff that's off the chain?
And can you elaborate?
There's all kinds of information in the world and processes and stuff that's not on the chain. I guess there's a third comment, is there's a resource issue associated with blockchain. It's a well-known issue. I don't want to pursue it, but lots and lots of electrical generation and stuff is associated with just running these things, and the value collapses when the machines turn off. So So the storage of value is dependent, I mean, there's an actual physical cost. If you're going to remember something forever, well, that's a perpetual motion machine. See, so this is like, I mean, seriously, it's going to manifest itself in generation. And so we have to decide how to forget stuff too.
So we happen to have an expert on voting mechanisms on the panel. And so,
Yes.
if possible, maybe I'll turn to Nic for the last comment here on
Well-
voting and governance and blockchains.
Yes, it is important to get the best out of a voting mechanism. It's true that voting mechanisms are filled with potential inconsistencies. But one of the nice things that my research has led to is the idea that if you're voting on what the right thing to do is, as opposed to, the right candidate among candidates, you almost always avoid the inconsistencies of voting. Voting gets into inconsistencies when you can put on the agenda any proposal to tax some people and provide benefits to others. That's when the inconsistencies become impossible.
Great. Bill?
I just wanted to jump in on the on-chain versus off-chain question, because as I mentioned before, we've got a few decades of off-chain systems under our belt that have a tremendous amount of institutional learning. They through the school of hard knocks and fixing things and all of that, and so this question of what belongs on on-chain and off-chain is one that we're starting to look at. I think it's really important. And those two systems, we believe that a lot of things will still happen off-chain, and blockchain will take its rightful role. The other thing I'd say is about consensus algorithms. So the proof of work consensus algorithm is incredibly expensive and resource intensive and slow. And that doesn't work for when you need high scalability, highly scalable networks. And I think we were talking about that too. There are other approaches to consensus. You don't necessarily need, if you have a transaction between a couple parties and they both want to agree to it, and you might have some other kind of checks and balances to confirm that they're actually the right parties and some other things. But you only need a few people to, or things to weigh in. Maybe to really get a pretty high confidence consensus around something. That's a much more scalable approach, and that's the kind of consensus algorithm that we think is going to prevail, at least for supply chain and economic purposes.
Part of the resource problem is this endless copying of chains, and
Yeah.
the growth in the change plus copying. So,
Yes.
so this is like a geometric expansion, you see.
Yeah.
There's a product of a product, and it's, so there's actually a bit of a myth of decentralization if everybody has to share the same chain. I know that there's hierarchy strategies, there's different things, but the only point of this isn't that it's hopeless or that you shouldn't do it or something. The point is that it isn't thought through. That's the point. It's a simple point. Voting schemes, this just assumption that the only way to do this is to replicate it or something approaching replication, endless growth, this has to be thought through. I mean, if you're going to take over the world, good idea to, not blow it up.
So the unfortunate part is we are out of time for this panel, but the good news is that we'll be able to continue some of this conversation later in the day. I'll just kind of remind everyone that questions, please tweet them to the address up here using the hashtag, and then the afternoon's panel will be able to revisit some of these topics with our panelists and the others. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.